In this video, we'll show you how to install a high-performance Rockford Fosgate audio system on this Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Welcome back. I'm Eric, and today we're going to install an HD14CVO-STAGE3 on this 2019 Street Glide CVO. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we have the bike flashed by an authorized Rockford Fosgate dealer. Now, we have a list of dealers that can flash on our website. The radio contains an excessive EQ curve that's preset by the factory. This is fine for OEM setups, but with the high-performance aftermarket system, we need to get rid of that EQ. This will allow you to experience the full potential of our audio system. To get started, we'll remove 3 thumb screws for the seats and use a 10mm socket to disconnect the battery negative. Now we're ready to remove the fairing. First, we'll install our service cover on the fender. Then we'll use a T27 Torx driver to remove 4 bolts from the inside and 3 bolts that hold the visor in place. Now it's best to have 2 people for this step, one to hold the fairing in position and the other to remove the screws. Once we pull down on the fairing, we'll disconnect any harnesses and remove it from the bike. Now that we have the fairing off, you'll notice there's a boom audio amplifier that we need to remove. To get started, we'll use a T27 Torx driver to remove 2 screws holding the upper vent in place. Then we'll move the antenna out of the way that's attached with Velcro and disconnect the amplifier harness. Then we'll use a 7/16 socket to remove 2 nuts from the right side of the boom amp's L bracket. Slide the amplifier out from the 2 pins holding it in on the opposite side. Then remove the boom amplifier bracket by using a T25 Torx to remove 4 screws that hold it in place. Now we're ready to remove our speaker pods. We'll start by disconnecting the harnesses on top using a flathead screwdriver and plastic removal tool. Then we'll use a 5/32 Allen driver to remove 2 screws from the top of each pod. We'll then move down and remove 3 bolts from the lower inside of the forks using a 7/16 socket with a swivel joint and extension. Now, these 3 bolts are very difficult to get to, so we recommend detaching 2 plastic rivets from the lower harness panel with a number 1 Phillips to give you some extra space. Finally, we'll use a 3/16 Allen to remove 3 screws from each pod. Now we're ready to remove our factory equipment and install our new speakers. As you can see, when we removed our speaker pods, there were some additional harnesses to remove. The TMS 6.5 speakers included in your kit do contain extra grills for road glide and tour pack installs. Now, for our batwing fairing, we're going to use this grill with the 3 tabs. We'll start by using a T25 Torx and remove 3 screws that hold the factory grill. We'll use the same hardware to secure our new ones in place. Take note when installing that the logo will reside at the bottom. We'll use the same T25 to remove 4 screws from the speaker pod and install the speaker with the logo toward the bottom as well. After that's done, we'll use the 3/16 Allen driver to secure the outer 3 screws that hold the pods in place. Before we move on to the next step, we'll go ahead and finish attaching our speaker pods and reattach our wiring harnesses, including the lower harness panel. Now we're ready to install our amp bracket. First, we'll stick on 4 included standoffs over the holes where the amplifier mounts. Now, these are very important because it isolates the heat generated from the amplifier and prevents it from transferring to the other electronics. Then we'll position the bracket with the heatsink fins facing the front. Using the supplied hardware and a 3mm Allen driver, secure the screws using the holes labeled 2014 Plus Street Glide. Now that we're done with that, we're ready to tune our amplifier and install it. Now we offer this free amp tuning guide that's available in the description of this video and through this kit's product details page at rockfordfosgate.com. Once we get the amplifier configured, we'll secure it to the amp bracket using the supplied hardware and a 2.5mm Allen driver. Before proceeding, be sure to remove the pre-installed power connector in the amp since our harness already has one. Now that we have that done, we're ready to remove the gas tank. We'll start off by disconnecting the electrical harnesses and pulling breather lines that are located in the back. Note that they may be zip tied underneath. Next, using a shop rag, we'll disconnect the gas line. Push up on the hose and while sliding the fitting upward, pull down on the gas line. Once that's done, detach the 2 rubber boots from both sides of the front of the gas tank and use a 1/2-inch socket to remove the 2 bolts. Then use the same socket to remove the 2 bolts in the back. Now that we have access to the center channel, we're ready to install our power harness. First, cut any zip ties off and unsnap the center harness cover. Once that's done, we'll take the power connector side of our harness and run it up to the clutch side of the motorcycle. We'll then use a small Phillips driver to unscrew a plastic rivet that holds a retaining bracket in between the forks. We'll route our harness through this bracket and up to the amplifier, making sure that you have enough slack to make your amplifier and battery connections. Simply plug the power connector into the amplifier and plug the blue wire into the empty connector on the top of the brake side. This blue wire is the amplifier remote turn-on. Take note that there is likely an empty plug that needs to be removed before making your connection. Now that we're done with that, we're ready to replace our bag lid speakers. Using a T20 Torx driver, remove 4 screws from the inside of the bag lid speaker housing. Hold the grill in place while removing the last screw. Then, remove the 4 screws holding the factory 5x7 and detach both plugs. Now we're ready to remove our lower fairing speakers and install our new ones. To get started, we'll use a 7/64 Allen to remove the 2 outer screws and slightly loosen the 2 inner screws. There's a retaining bracket on the inner side that we want to keep intact. Pull on the outer edge of the speaker to start removing it. Then start pulling it out diagonally to completely remove it from the housing. Disconnect the speaker wires and finish removing the 2 inner screws to detach the retaining bracket. On the new speaker, remove the grill from the trim ring and position it along with the retaining bracket behind the speaker. Keep the 2 screws slightly loose at this time. Connect your speaker wires and insert the speaker into the housing opposite the way we removed it. Once seated, install the 2 outer screws into place, then finish securing the speaker by tightening the 2 inner screws. Finally, insert the grill with the logo oriented toward the bottom. Now we're ready to install our T-harness. This is an all-new design with some cool features. First, we'll disconnect the main harness from the back of the factory source unit. Push the little catch pin in that locks the harness in place and slide the lever open. Plug this end into the female end of our T-harness and lock it into place. Then plug the male end of our harness into the source unit and slide the lever until you hear it click. Take the harness labeled amp input and connect them to the corresponding front and rear input jacks on the amplifier. Then take the harness labeled amp output and connect the corresponding front and rear output jacks to the amplifier. Now we'll show you how to bypass the factory amplifiers so we can use our TM400X4 AD. For the amplifier under the fairing, connect the plug labeled Boom Amp Bypass. Now newer versions of this plug will be labeled CVO 4-speaker Boom 2. Then we'll come back to our saddlebags. For our left bag, detach the wiring harness from the factory amp and insert the plug into the harness labeled CVO Amp Bypass Left Saddlebag. For the right bag, detach the wiring harness from the factory amp and insert the plug into the harness labeled CVO Amp Bypass Right Saddlebag. Then just tuck the harnesses back in and close the flaps. Now that we have all that done, we're ready to make our battery connections. We'll use a 1/2-inch socket to remove 2 screws that hold the engine control module in place. We'll disconnect a couple harnesses and flip the ECM tray up to make our positive terminal connection. Then we'll reconnect our negative cable with our amp ground. Once that's done, we'll put everything back in place. Now we're ready to clean up our wiring. You likely noticed some extra wires on our T-harness and included in the kit. This harness allows you to use our DSR1 digital signal processor. For more information, download our DSR1 setup guide for Harley-Davidson and keep an eye out for a complete configuration video we'll be releasing in the future. Now, since we're not using a DSR1 on this motorcycle, we'll zip tie this blue wire that's used with the processor. We also include 2 sets of Y adapters that are not used on this motorcycle but are covered in other videos. Now that we have everything cleaned up, we're ready to reassemble the bike and test the system. I want to reiterate, before testing, make sure that the factory radio is flashed. Now regarding maintenance and durability of the system, we get a lot of questions about getting the speakers wet. Now, they are element ready, so they can withstand water, dust, and UV rays. However, avoid using a pressure washer on the bike, and be sure to close the vent to help prevent water from getting to the inside of the fairing. This will protect your amplifier and all your electrical components. As you can see, that install is pretty straightforward. If you prefer to have a professional do the install for you, we have a network of authorized Rockford Fosgate dealers that can be found on our website. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact our technical support. They can be reached Monday through Friday at 1-800-669-9899 or through live chat at the bottom of our website at rockfordfosgate.com. Until next time, I'm Eric. We'll see you again soon.